Britain's always has been one of the most centralised states in the world. If a new government didn't come in with the aim of kind of rewiring the state much more fundamentally rather than just thinking we're better people, they were going to fail in the same way. We're going to get to the point, and I think we're pretty close to it now, where this system was just going to break completely.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. My name's Tom Clougherty. I'm the Executive Director here at the IEA. And for the next hour, approximately, I'm going to be in conversation with our star guest, Sam Freedman, who is, of course, you know this already, but the author of Failed State, Why Nothing Works and How to Fix It. Sam is a senior fellow at the Institute for Government. He's a senior advisor to ARC Schools. He's the co-author of Britain's most popular politics Substack. Comment is Freed. He's had a variety of jobs in the past. He was a senior policy advisor in Michael Gove's days at the Department for Education. For 5 years, he was the executive director of Teach First. He is, I suppose, a current think tanker with the Institute for Government and a former think tanker with Policy Exchange in the late 2000s. And okay, Sam, we'll jump right into it. Welcome to the IEA.
Well, thank you very much.
Very nice to have you here. The book, I think, has been well received. It's been widely reviewed. Let me do the really cliche book club question first, although perhaps the title says it all. What brought you to write about the failed state of Britain?
Well, summer of 2022, so I sort of quit my job a year earlier, was starting to make my way as a freelance writer, and was watching as the Boris Johnson government collapsed, as the Liz Truss fiasco sort of happened, and sort of felt that there was a lot of commentary that was very focused on them as individuals and people like Dominic Cummings and other people who had been very recently involved, and Brexit, or sort of the reasons why all of this was happening. And I wanted to, I was worried that I thought, Labour are probably going to win the next election now, which they obviously did. And I'm worried that, a new set of ministers is going to come in and think, okay, well, the reason the last lot failed is because they were all a bunch of idiots. They were all like, all of these people didn't know what they were doing. It's all because of a very recent phenomenon. And if we just, we're just nice people and we're just trying to do the right thing and we're quite smart, we'll make everything work. And I kind of wanted to write something that got across that this rot in our institutions is a lot deeper and has been setting in for a lot longer. I argue sort of over a 40-year period, but you could argue even longer than that. And that if a new government didn't come in with the aim of kind of rewiring the state much more fundamentally rather than just thinking we're better people, they were going to fail in the same way. So it needed that kind of institutional analysis rather than just saying it's the fault of this group of individuals.
Yeah. I mean, have you been rather prophetic in that? Do you think that the problem that led you to write the book actually has come to pass with the new government, thinking that by not being the Tories, things would start working again?
Yeah, I mean, I do slightly regret not writing it a bit earlier, because it only came out a week after the election. Look, I mean, I think there are elements of what I write about that some Labour ministers understand, people like Pat McFadden, to some degree Starmer. You saw before Christmas, Starmer gave that very frustrated speech about this, what did you call it, the tepid bath of decline or whatever. Yeah. They are very frustrated. As I write in the book, we've had this succession of prime ministers. They come into number 10. They think, right, now I'm in control. What levers can I pull? And then realise they're not really attached to anything, and that the institutions that they have to work with are much less effective than they thought, including the civil service, including the way Parliament works as well, and so on. So I think they have kind of realised that. Perhaps they could have realised it earlier. It's really hard to do something about it when you're in government, because obviously then you're being hit by the day-to-day noise of everything. What's Donald Trump announced this morning, etc. Everything is a new crisis. Every day brings a new crisis, a call for a new reset, and you haven't got the time to think, okay, how are we going to do this? There are some things that I think they are moving on, devolution, which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit more. but other areas where I think they really haven't thought enough about what they want to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's talk about some of the big ideas in the book then. And it's structured it's beautifully written, by the way, and it's structured in a very pleasingly logical fashion. So you've got three big problems and you kind of go through them one after the other. So the first problem is this idea of overload, that we have concentrated power at the centre of government. I think I'm actually paraphrasing a direct quote here. We've concentrated power at the centre of government, destroyed state capacity outside it, and massively increase the scope of what government does. This has led to a kind of paralysis. Can you tell us a little bit more, this idea of overload? Just explain the thesis there.
Yeah, so the idea is that Britain's always has been one of the most centralised states in the world, but has become, and particularly England, has become increasingly centralised as local government has been weakened significantly over 40 years, and then more recently lost a lot of its funding as well. I think, for a lot of local government, it's now essentially a social care funding agency that does bins. It's been really undermined by decades of policy. We don't have a regional tier of government. We're not a federal state. Again, if you're thinking really of England here rather than the United Kingdom. And that sort of means we've got all of this power, increasing power, that sits in Westminster, and at the same time that's happened, obviously the state has become a much more complicated thing to run. Things like digital regulation were not an issue 30, 40 years ago. Citizens have started to expect a lot more of government in terms of what it gets involved in and what it does. That's true sort of worldwide. So to expect Westminster politicians and departments in Westminster to be able to cover both the sort of high-level strategic, which is getting increasingly complicated, and the detail, which they do in a way that doesn't happen in any other country, leaves ministers very overloaded. And I give the example of when I was working in the Department for Education. If an individual school wants to sell a bit of land, it has to get permission from the Secretary of State. I don't think that would be true in any other country in the world. It's sort of a level of micromanagement. And because the Secretary of State, it wasn't taken very long or her very long to sign off one bit of paper, but it's that constant stream of very low-level decision-making occupying civil servants and ministers that then prevents you from looking at the bigger picture, whilst also meaning that you lose the kind of state capacity that other countries, from America to Germany in different ways, have at their state or regional or local level, which allows a lot of services to happen there. We don't have that.
Yeah. I was very interested in what you write about the school reforms of that early 2010 period, because obviously you were closely involved in that, both working on education policy outside government first and then as a civil servant when those reforms were being put through. But I guess in a way, surely it wasn't the intention of those school reforms to have the Secretary of State signing off on a school having to sell a parcel of land. Although perhaps I got a skewed impression coming at this very much from the perspective of market-oriented reform. But my idea of academisation and the free schools policy was not so much that power would be centralised to the Department of Education. If it was only about taking power away from local education authorities and giving it to the DfE, I'm not sure anybody really would have been in favour of that. The idea, I thought, was to make the schools more autonomous, give them freedom to act, but then introduce more choice and competition, so sort of quasi-market forces that would act as a sort of regulator so that the government could step back, both locally and centrally. That obviously didn't happen. Did that not happen because that wasn't actually what people were thinking, or did something else get in the way?
That's a really good question. I think you can compare it as well to NHS trusts, which are a very similar kind of idea, where in practice you have not seen that kind of quasi-market develop. And in fact, what you've seen is the central state just get much more involved in the detail of actually running these institutions. And I suspect that's because if something is in control of ministers and they're getting blamed for it, the natural inclination is to try and fix it, right? You're being told as a head teacher or a hospital manager comes up to you and says, I've got this particular problem. And you think, okay, let's introduce a new law or regulation to fix it. But, that accumulates and accumulates, at least when it's, and I say in the book, local government was not running schools well. That's why we wanted to do the reform in the first place. But at least there you have the chance to say, well, we've got in theory this capacity that we could try and improve and make better. But if we just suck it all into ourselves and end up running everything ourselves, that's actually going to be less functional.
And I'll ask the fairly obvious free market question at this point, although I think we could come back to it later as well. If government is overloaded, is the solution simply for them to do less? And what do you think prevents government from being able to do less?
That's the kind of question I didn't particularly look at in the book, because I wanted the book to appeal to people from all kinds of political persuasions. And that's a much more kind of values-based question. It depends on what you want from society. If you want society to be more equal, for instance, and you want redistribution and fairness, and that's your kind of value-based, then government has to be much more involved, because there's no other actor that can do it. If that matters less to you, then you want less of it. But I think you look around the world, governments of right or left, it is extremely difficult now to not get involved in, at very least, the running of major public services, the administration of law and order and safety. Regulation is becoming increasingly, as I said, regulations are becoming increasingly complex. And you can see Labour at the moment say, we want less regulation. It's meaningless to say we want more or less regulation. Is it good regulation? What are you regulating? To what end? So I'm not sure it's very helpful. It's not the way I tend to think about things, with more or less of it. It's what's the purpose? Would it be useful? And there's certainly things I think government do that I don't think they need to do. But to me, that's not the problem. It's more about, you say you want to do these things, fine, but you don't actually have the capacity to do them effectively. So if you want to do those things, and you've decided as a government or a series of governments over time, that's what the state should be doing, then you've got to build the necessary functionality to actually deliver them.
Yeah. So I think we'll come back to the point about localism and decentralisation of power later, I think, when we talk about some of the solutions that you propose in the book. Before we move on to the second pillar of your argument, I just wanted to ask a little bit about the Treasury mindset, because you have a number of pages about the Treasury mindset effectively in the book. And I think one of the strange things I've observed recently, and we all know the reasons, is people on the right, conservatives, have started banging on about the Treasury mindset, when surely the Treasury mindset is a sort of fiscal conservatism writ large across Whitehall. Now, obviously, it's a bit more complicated than that. How much of a problem do you see the Treasury being in your thesis here?
So I argue that as part of this wider centralisation, the Treasury has become the most powerful bit of Whitehall, and has, so you've got a centralisation from local to centre, and then within the centre, a centralisation from departments to the Treasury, which was really kicked off in earnest. I mean, it started, I think you could argue, back with the IMF intervention in 1976, that gave the Treasury the argument within government to push for much more spending control. And that they sort of kept increasing that through the 80s and 90s. But then Gordon Brown came in 97 and saw the Treasury as an alternative base of power, obviously, for himself. And his view of his deal with Blair was that he would be running a lot of social policy from the Treasury. And so it started to actually get much more involved in second-guessing departmental policy. So it wasn't just, no, you can't have any more money. It was, you can't have any more money for that, but we will give you more money for that because we, as the Treasury, think it's a good idea. And that I think has got sort of out of hand. And although it's dissipated a bit post Brown, I think that has now been quite ingrained in the Treasury as a way of thinking, that shadow guessing every department and every bit of government. But you've also got this sort of idea of Treasury brain, which is not so much about fiscal conservatism, because all finance departments around the world have to say no to stuff, right? That's part of their job, because otherwise we'd all go bankrupt. But saying no in a really short-termist way. So you can think of lots of examples from recent years where you've had, because of the way our fiscal rules are designed, and I think in a very silly way, there's been a sort of rigidity to the spending decisions which haven't made a lot of sense. So even before HS2 was sort of fully cancelled, the decision was made to delay the Euston link for several years to fit spending plans. Now, that meant it was going to cost hundreds of millions of pounds more money, but it just meant it fitted the spending plans that they need. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where it's actually wasteful, but they've become fixated with meeting very short-termist numbers. It's become a very scorecard-based way of thinking rather than actually what's the most financially effective way to run the country. And again, you can't sort of apply dynamic costing to everything. You can't say, because everyone can argue, okay, well, if we spend more on education, we spend more on health, we'll save money in the long run because we'll have a healthier, smarter population. And you can always make that argument. And they can't sort of say yes every time someone says that. But when it's a really specific example where delaying something is going to cost money or not doing something now is going to cost money, it's, when I was in the department, we knew we weren't spending enough on repairing school buildings. We knew they were all going to start falling down, and that was going to cost more money, and it is now costing more money. So it's just very short-termist.
And it does seem to be one of the main pathologies of any publicly run service, actually, that you get chronic underinvestment on the capital side.
Yeah.
And probably the fiscal rules exacerbate that, because the easy thing to do whenever your 5-year rolling target looks in jeopardy is, well, we'll just defer the capital expenditure a bit more, protect day-to-day services. And you keep doing that, you end up roughly where we are, I suppose. So let's move on to your second key problem with Britain's failed state, which is executive dominance. And I suppose the question I want to pose here is, probably a lot of people will say, yes, constitutionally, we have an extremely powerful executive without the checks and balances that most other democracies have in place. On the other hand, if we look back over the last 8 years, so since the Brexit vote, effectively, it doesn't feel very much like our executive has been dominant. It actually seems like, despite having large majorities for much of that period, and this is probably true of Labour now as well to a certain extent, the executive actually feels a little bit enfeebled, as if they can't drive forward their own agenda, despite the obvious constitutional power that they have. But obviously you see executive dominance as a big problem, and I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive in that. I think the executive keeps getting incredibly frustrated about how hard it is finding to achieve its objectives. But then, rather than thinking through how, why that might be the case, they jump to, well, it's because we don't have enough control, we don't have enough power. Now, as you say, those powers are there. We have one of the most powerful executives in the world. So just taking more and more power into the executive, which is the pattern we've seen in recent decades, isn't fixing it. And yet we keep going down that same avenue. And I would argue that's one of the things that is perhaps ironically making it harder for governments to be effective. So to take Parliament as an example, we saw both the new Labour government and the Conservative coalition and Conservative governments weaken Parliament in a number of ways, so that parliamentary debate has become pretty irrelevant now to the passage of a bill. But if you have a majority, it was different during that kind of Brexit period. And you can essentially limit the amount of time you spend talking about really important legislation to a very short period. And you can ignore the views of backbenchers, as long as you've got a solid majority of on your own side, which means the quality of legislation has deteriorated massively because there's no, you're not going to get challenged on it. You will get challenged in the Lords, but firstly, that's not going to get much press coverage, and also ultimately the Lords will pretty much always back down in the end if it comes to it. But it also means the Lords are then having to deal with a lot of really shoddy legislation, and it's getting overwhelmed and overloaded as well. And then what you get is a lot of stuff ending up in the courts,
right,
which we're seeing more and more. More policy is being decided in the courts and judges have been quite explicit about this over the years, because it's increasingly poorly drafted and unclear as to its intent and purposes. So you have this kind of really negative effects across the piece as to why it's happening. But rather than saying, okay, well, let's try and have better legislative processes, let's try and have better scrutiny of what we're doing right up front so it's higher quality, you instead have governments saying, we're going to make it harder to judicially review us. We're going to make it even harder for MPs to kind of get in our way. We're going to make it even harder for the Lords to block what we're trying to do, as if that's the problem rather than the quality of the legislation in the first place. And this is we've seen Labour started briefing against the Attorney General in the last couple of weeks on exactly the thing, because they're so frustrated. We can't do anything because you keep telling us it's illegal. Well, make it legal. I mean, make the law work. So I think that's a kind of example of how this kind of dynamic's gone really wrong. And in a way, the same applies to civil service. Governments have got more and more frustrated with what they see as the civil service blocking them. So they try to take more and more power onto themselves, disempowered the civil service, which has got weaker. A lot of the good people have left. And you go around in a circle.
There's a quote, and in a way, I apologise for bringing him up, but you do mention him several times in the book, from Dominic Cummings. And I don't know if this is from one of his blogs or from Twitter or something, but it's something he says a lot. The government doesn't control the government, and moreover has no interest in doing so. And I've always thought that was actually quite a good description of what I see going on in democratic politics in Westminster. Would you subscribe to that view? Both that the government, the elected government, the executive, doesn't really feel in control, but secondly, that they're not that interested in being in control. They're playing a game for the media a lot of the time. I guess this will feed directly into your third major critique.
I mean, as always with Dominic, I agree with some of what he says, but he always goes a bit further than I do. He's a touch more hyperbolic than I am. I say this as someone who worked with him for 4 years. It is certainly the case that ministers really struggle to make government work, because there's what I've argued, and you've got this kind of overload, this sort of confusion, this huge kind of sprawling canvas that they don't understand, which has got ever bigger for all sorts of reasons. And then but I think some ministers want to try and make it work, and over time they get to the point where they can. I think Michael Gove became an effective minister over time. A lot think this is, I'm not doing that. That's too difficult. I'm just going to get good press headlines in whatever my friendly press is, and build up my profile and get promoted.
Yeah.
You can see that very clearly in the career of quite a few of the last government who did end up in very senior positions, who I would argue did very little as ministers, but were very good at getting attention and headlines, but were never really interested in doing anything. So to that extent, I agree with Dominic. Where we really disagree is, and I talk about this in the book, is his prescription for this is even more executive control. His prescription for this is basically, let me and all my clever physicist mates run everything, and we will sort it all out for you, unlike these idiot politicians, and make everything work. And I would argue that's exactly the wrong way around. That's what we've been doing for 30 years. And in fact, what we need to do is disperse power much more widely, so that it's not so concentrated in the hands of a small number of people who, may be well intentioned, but are not going to be able to cope with that much. And we saw that when he was in government.
You mentioned Michael Gove, so let me ask you a question about him. There's a common argument or discussion among Conservatives at the moment, and I'm sure you hear it as well, that they never really had a chance in government, that everything was set up against them to frustrate their conservative instincts. And so even with the best will in the world and the greatest ideas, the civil service or the Lords or the judiciary or whatever would block them, the blob. So that's an expression most associated, I guess, with Michael Gove in the first place, talking about the blob in education. Now, the counter-argument to that, which I've heard from some people, is indeed to look at Michael Gove. And whether you agree with the things he was trying to do or not, and in some cases, I think free marketers would agree with what he was trying to do, in other cases, they wouldn't. But nevertheless, it appears to be an example of a government minister who, first of all, really knew what he wanted, and had a clear idea and was able to articulate that to civil servants and so on. Secondly, that probably unlike most of the others, he surrounded himself with people who had genuine policy expertise and could help them drive forward that agenda. I'm just curious, from your experience in the DFE in those early days after 2010, what was it, or maybe you disagree with the whole thesis of this question, but what was it that made Michael Gove successful in implementing an agenda which, after all, was sort of workshopped in free market think tanks and everything like policy exchange, where so many of his colleagues failed?
Well, I think you've kind of answered the question, because he knew what he wanted to do. I think the sort of sense that the reason it's so hard to do anything is because the civil service are also left-wing is just obviously not true. We can see that from how they actually behave in practice. I'm sure that a lot of them are personally more likely to be voting for Liberal or left parties, but they do what they're asked to do. And they did when we were in the Department for Education. We had a few issues very early on with leaking from a few people who'd been very close to Ed Balls. But then once they left, the department really did try and achieve the agenda, and did. Because there was a clear agenda. The problem a lot of the time, firstly, is that they're not given direction. So there's no clarity over what it is the minister wants to achieve. So then, of course, they're not going to be able to deliver it. But also, there are structural problems with the effectiveness of the civil service. But again, you can do stuff about that. You have the levers to do that. That's not them as individuals not wanting to do the work. It's the fact that their sort of systems of, the systems of sort of promotion and moving people around and so on are quite unhelpful to delivering things some of the time. But you have the ability to do civil service reform if you want. So it's kind of very frustrating to continually see people sort of saying, oh, everyone was out to get us, when they don't really try and do anything. It's like we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas. It's really, it's just not credible. So no, I don't think that's very compelling when you see that, not just Michael, but other ministers were able. The civil service did put through Brexit. Yeah, most civil servants voted Remain by a big majority, but they did it. Didn't enjoy it, but they did it. And they did it pretty fast in the end. And the main problem there was Parliament not knowing what it wants to do. So they are absolutely willing to do what the elected government wants. They just have to be given direction, and there has to be some proper civil service reform.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to your third big argument, which in a sense I think ties the other two together and is maybe at the root of them to a certain extent. Which is the role of media and the sort of frenetic pace it drives in modern politics and modern government. And it's the reason why the communications team is twice the size of the policy team in number 10 and sits with the Prime Minister or near the Prime Minister rather than up in the attic. I don't know if the geography is still the same, but you describe in the book. How do you think... So first of all, I guess in the Blair era, you had the advent of rolling news, 24/7 news media. That changed the pace thing. Then you had online, social media and everything come on. How much does this drive, government being overloaded because these stories are cropping up constantly and they have to respond to them? But then secondly, how does that feed into the executive dominance in the sense that, you're in number 10, ultimately people are going to ask you on the Today programme or whatever it is, what are you doing about story X, story Y, story Z? So you think, I have to be in charge of all of these things.
Yeah. So, I think clearly politics is partly about communication. You need to sell your ideas to the electorate, to the wider public. You need to explain what you're doing. And if you can't do that, you're not going to be very successful. So communication has always been important. The problem, I argue, is that communications has now become the starting point, and then policy follows communications, which is absolutely the wrong way around. It should be starting with policy and then figuring out how best and most effectively to persuade people of your ideas. And I think that has been driven in part by this, just the speed, as you say, of news coverage, as the arrival of 24-hour news, the arrival of the internet, the arrival then of social media have all just sped up the political cycle to the point where you don't have time to react to anything. And it's also because of the very active way that governments now try and manage the media to control the sort of day-to-day. Again, prime ministers have always been interested in how to manage media. David Lloyd George bought a newspaper. He rather corruptly, made quite a lot of money out of it. But it was really, you had some of it during the Thatcher period. Bernard Ingham was the first, I would call, really kind of modern press secretary in Number 10, who Joe Haynes arguably for Harold Wilson, but Bernard Ingham really started to put a lot of these systems in place and understood how to use the lobby system to generate the kind of coverage he wanted. But Thatcher herself was clearly had her own very clear policy agenda and didn't actually read the papers very much. Blair was quite similar in that he did have a clear agenda and he knew what he wanted to do. But he had Alistair Campbell, who really systematised a lot of this stuff and got rid of a lot of what had been a fairly independent government information service. There were still a lot of civil servants working on it, but they all had to then follow the message. It was much more message-driven, much more top-down way of doing communications. And it was pretty effective in the first instance at making New Labour successful at communications. But what's happened over the last kind of 25 years or so is that the comms model he put in place has remained, but the strategic policy direction's gone. You don't have the Thatcher, you don't have the Blair. You've just got the Alistair Campbell. You've just got the people saying, well, for the grid, what we need today for what we need for the grid for next week is a story about immigration, a story about schools, whatever. And that is what's driving the policy development process. Or it certainly was under the last government. And by the end of the last government, it had become really chronic. I think this government's a little bit different. I think they are still trying to do policy development first, but they're really struggling with it, right? Yeah. They're really struggling to communicate a message because it's not how our political system is designed to, and our media system is designed to operate anymore. So it's a very, as I say, pretty much everyone in the book, from Conservative governments, from Labour governments, raised it as a really serious problem in trying to do good policy these days.
Yeah, and I always think of, there's lots of things in the thick of it that you sort of resonate if you spend enough time in Westminster, but one particular one where they're frantically trying to come up with a policy and someone says, can we please sit down and discuss it? And they say, well, why should we sit down? She says, well, because we've got chairs, we might as well use them. And I think that there are other things we could say about this media bit, but I think we should move, before we get questions from the audience, onto the solutions part of the book, because you say up front, I don't want to be one of these books that spends 300 pages on all the problems and then has a slim chapter at the end hinting at some solutions. You try and embed the solutions throughout the book. Now, you say in the introduction, to make Britain not a failed state, to make things work again, we need change on the scale of universal suffrage, the post-war expansion of the welfare state, or the economic revolution of the Thatcher years. Now, that's a pretty bold statement, a pretty sweeping change. So what do you think are the answers? How do we make Britain not a failed state in your view?
So I argue that we had, if you sort of go through some of those sort of examples, you had a crisis of democratic legitimacy in the early part of the 20th century, and that was resolved with suffrage. In the 1970s, you had an economic crisis that was resolved, at least initially, by Denis Healey and then Margaret Thatcher. And what we've got now is a crisis of governance. So whilst governance solutions tend to sound less exciting than a lot of other things you could talk about, actually that's what we need. And we need I argue, some pretty substantial ones. So I talk a lot about decentralising power, essentially building a regional tier of government. And we're starting to do that actually through the combined authorities, through the arrival of mayors. And that's something that initially began right at the tail end of New Labour. It was George Osborne who sort of said we need to have mayors in all of these or in a lot of these. Labour are taking it on. We had a white paper end of last year, taking it a bit further. It's all good directional stuff. I don't think it goes anywhere near far enough. So one of the biggest issues with the mayors as they're currently structured is they don't have any fiscal power. They can't raise any money. So what you've got at the moment, if you're a mayor, is you ask Westminster for money, and if you don't get it, you say, well, they didn't give me any money. And if you do get it, you say, well, aren't I brilliant for getting all this money? It's been there's no. You don't have to, I wouldn't say the job of a mayor is easy, but it's not, you don't have the real challenge of governance, which is the trade-offs. And it's not in the interest of central government either to make mayors supplicants. I think we made this mistake with Scotland. We did eventually give them tax raising powers, but by not doing so, the SNP was able to win for a very long time just by saying Westminster are evil bastards who aren't giving us any money. So I think you have to look at local tax raising powers and making them, giving them that kind of responsibility. And that will not only give them that responsibility, it will also create a much stronger incentive than we have in our system at the moment for regional economic growth, which has been one of the core kind of problems that we've known about in this country for decades and decades and have never been able to do anything about. We've had, John Prescott and his LEPs and RDAs and then this government with their models, but we've never been able to get it working and levelling up and so on. But only through actually having genuine local democratic decision making that has a meaningful impact on people's lives are you going to generate that. So I think a big decentralisation is part one. A second part is changing the nature of Parliament, changing what an MP is. At the moment, an MP is either someone who's going to support their local constituency, or they're a minister or a shadow minister. And both of those are noble things to do, but none of them are legislators. That's not why they're there. They're not there to scrutinise legislation. They're not there to hold the government to account. They're not taught how to do it. They're not trained how to do it. There's no support, and there's no point because Parliament isn't designed to enable them to do that effectively. You did a little bit through select committees. So again, I argue you should really fundamentally change the role of MPs so that they have more powers, more tools, partly through a much beefed up select committee system to actually hold the executive to account. Not to stop an executive with the majority from doing things, but just to be able to say, just to be able to properly scrutinise what's going through so they can draw attention to problems that will otherwise just occur later down the line. I talk about civil service reform as well as something that you could do properly, been talked about for many decades, but you could really go at it properly, but no government ever wants to prioritise it. So yeah, there's other stuff in there as well, but those are some of the big ideas.
Okay. So final question, then we'll take some from the floor. You're kind of at the time of writing in this book is January 24. If the time of writing was January 25, would anything have been different?
So I wrote a prologue for the paperback edition, which is coming out in April, which sort of reflected a bit on the first, when I wrote it, 5 months of the Labour administration. And whilst I think they have in some areas shifted a little bit in the direction that I'm talking about, I say particularly on devolution, although not as far as I would like, they are getting caught up in a lot of the problems I talk about in the book. They have immediately got in and found themselves to be overwhelmed, and pretty much exactly the way I predict they would find in chapter 1 of the book. In number 10, they haven't been able to get number 10 that's functional or working. As a result, the Treasury has essentially become the default decision maker in the government, which is distorting strategy significantly. And they have got overloaded. I mean, they've almost said it explicitly. They are not treating Parliament with any more respect, I don't think, than the last government. You look at the workers' rights bill. It's not a bill, right? It's just a skeleton. There's nothing in it. And that's exactly the type of very poor legislational model that the last government did far too much of as well. It's called a skeleton bill, where you don't actually put any of the content in the bill, so no one can scrutinise it. So I think you're seeing them caught in a lot of the same traps, and then absolutely the same media trap of not being sure how to. You can kind of see them wanting to feed this beast with kind of nonsense policy stories, but also wanting to do real policy and getting caught between the two as well. So, yeah, I think they've got wrapped up in a lot of the same problems. All
right. And do you see it improving? Are you an optimist?
So I think a lot of people have read the book and told me it's quite depressing. And this is the optimistic version, because the publisher said when he sent back his comments, said, please could you make the ending a bit more positive? I'm optimistic in the sense that it's going to get so bad that it has to change.
Okay.
Right? Like, we're going to get to the point, and I think we're pretty close to it now, where where this system is just going to break completely, and the demand for something different is going to become so big that you're going to have to think bigger than either of our main parties are at the moment. And I basically finished the book by saying, if you don't do that, some populist is going to come along and convince people that they're the dramatic alternative solution that you want instead. And well, Reform are leading in some polls now, so I think that's already happening to some degree. And if it's not, Farage, it will be someone else. And this again is not just a UK issue. We're seeing this happen across the world. So I think I argue in the beginning of the book, with all of these crises, whether it's of democracy, of economics, it kind of has to hit a real nadir before people are willing to make the necessary big changes. Don't think we're that far away from it.
Yeah. So it's a kind of optimism that things are going to get really bad.
Yeah.
And it will force things to get better.
It's darkness before the dawn.
This is the kind of thing we talk about here as well, actually, believe it or not. So questions from the audience. Yeah, gentleman on the end of the line at the back. Yes.
Yeah, you said one of the solutions is more layers of government. Surely one of the better solutions would be more markets, less regulation, get rid of DEI like in the US, just free up people's productive capacity. Civil service is massively overstaffed. You could get rid of that. You could get rid of 20% of the civil service and things wouldn't be any different in terms of the way it works. But it would free up money and cash. And it seems to me that no one thinks about the obvious solutions that Thatcher did, that this institution talks about many times. It's the marketization of things rather than more government. More government's never the solution.
Well, it's a tricky one.
I mean, we should have anticipated that question here. So, I mean, the one bit of that I really do agree with is that the civil service is too large. And I do talk about how if you did a proper civil service reform program, you would be able to reduce it. But you need to do it not in the way that governments have tried to reduce the civil service numbers, which is just by doing temporary staffing freezes and voluntary redundancy programs, which means all the good people leave, but by actually giving senior civil servants real accountability and also the necessary levers to pay really good people more, so you don't, and to reduce numbers. So I do agree with that bit. I mean, I think saying things like, well, it's markets are always a solution or less government's always a solution. That's not how the world works, right? Like sometimes it will be the solution. There are examples where, absolutely makes sense to bring in markets to as a way of providing a service. And there's other times it doesn't. And just to say one or the other doesn't make much sense. I have a chapter in the book on contracting out and the mess I think successive governments have got to on contracting out. And what I argue in that chapter is this sort of belief that you can sort of magically create markets to provide services just doesn't apply. And we've seen that happen over and over again. Contracting out can work really well when you've got an existing market, when you know what you want and can easily measure it, and when you're passing on the risk to that contractor. When you're not doing those things, you don't get a market. You just get a mess that the state is still ultimately responsible for. We saw that in spades with the probation contracting out model, which I give detailed analysis of. You end up with Sodexo running half our probation system. It's a school food company. That's not a market. That's just a mess. So I think you have to take it case by case, and if you apply any kind of dogmatic approach to this stuff, you end up creating more problems.
Just a brief supplement to that. I would imagine that the rhetoric is not to your taste, but do you look at something like Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency program and see any potential solutions there? So taking a sort of forensic data-driven approach to government?
I'm not sure that's what he's doing. I'd like to believe it was. Look, clearly, if you did reform properly, whether of the US or UK civil service, there is a lot of waste. There's a lot of things you could do differently. You could run things much more effectively. I think the kind of the problem with the move fast and break things model is, well, then there's a lot of broken stuff that is not necessarily the stuff you want to break. And when you're talking about government, that's quite a lot more serious than a technology company. And I suspect that's what will happen in America, is they'll break something that a lot of voters really care about, and it'll be reined in fairly sharpish. But clearly, that it's so frustrating to be caught between, the Musk Cummings just smash everything up kind of model and the let's leave everything it is model. There's clearly a middle ground here where if you actually just took your time to design reform and you said to the cabinet secretary, your job is not to be a fixer to the prime minister, but is to lead a massive and properly designed change management process across Westminster, you might get somewhere. But we always either do it in a really rushed, half-assed way, or we don't do it at all.
All right. Yes, let's take these two questions here in the second row.
In recent times, we've heard a lot about the rise of the administrative state. And give you a classic example, nutrient neutrality rules and the loss of sovereignty from the point of view of the government minister. And if you listen to people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Liz Truss, they point to examples like the Office for Budget Responsibility or rural England having a particular policy, and you want to change that as a minister and you can't. The power is dispersed, so you are no longer an effective representative of a classic British citizen. You've lost political sovereignty. How do you address that problem?
So, they haven't lost sovereignty, they've lost control. They do have the power to change all of these things. They just don't know how to, because they don't understand the systems that they're working in. There's no sovereignty issue, but there really is a control issue. And I talk a lot. I have a section in the book about the rise of the regulatory state. I call it that rather than the administrative state, where within departments, you've seen this huge expansion of regulatory agencies that are ultimately responsible to a Secretary of State. But the Secretary of State doesn't begin to understand what it is that they do or what they need to change within them to get what they want out of them. And that is a function of central government being so overloaded. It's a function of ministers being responsible for everything that happens in the state. If you took some of that away from them, then they would be able to focus more, if they were good ministers, on fixing the things that they want to fix. OBR is similar. The OBR don't have any power to do anything. But right now, the Treasury are arguing with the OBR over whether certain things that are going to go into the spending review will get a positive rating in the OBR report. And I don't think any ministers really, maybe some do, but I don't think many ministers understand that process. So there's a lot just going on underneath the surface that they're not on top of because this has just got all so big. And that's part of the problem.
I'll take the other question for the second row and then Tom Burrows, and then, yes, I've got some other hands over here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam. A really interesting talk, and thank you for coming here today. You just on your point about Elon Musk, one similarity with Dominic Cummings is that they both came to power under what could be argued to be populist politicians who had quite messy blonde hair. Is the comparison too simplistic, or do you think there is some similarities there, given that you worked with Cummings? And what recommendations would you give to future prime ministers to make people like Elon Musk and Dominic Cummings successful in what they're trying to do? But my main question is really about comparative politics. I know you haven't put yourself out as a comparative government person, but have you seen any examples around the world of governments and states that have been able to avoid some of the failings that you set out in your book?
Great question. So on the first one, I think Trump's hair is more orange than blonde, but yeah. There is a big similarity, which I think both Cummings and Musk have said completely explicitly. They see these politicians as vehicles to achieve their goals, people who can win elections so they don't have to, so they can get into government and fix everything. And I think in both cases, ultimately, that will fail. It did fail with Cummings, and it will fail with Musk because the politician is the one ultimately who has the power, and when they get annoyed and when they get into fights, they will always ultimately win. I think if you wanted to harness the resources of these type of people more effectively, you'd have to have a minister who really knew what they wanted to do. They were in charge and were able to say, look, I want to bring you in to achieve a specific goal. And when Dominic was working for Michael, it was still pretty hairy being there, but he was much more effective, I'd say, because Michael knew what he wanted to do, and in a way that Boris absolutely didn't. So I think I definitely think it needs to. It's a really good example, but in both cases of when you don't have properly accountable democratic power, and that doesn't that always doesn't work in the end. What was your second question? It was about comparisons. Yeah. So I deliberately didn't try and go around the world find examples because Estonia, Singapore, they're so different culturally from us that you can't just become Singapore because we've got a functioning democracy and so on. But we're massive. They're a city. We're a country. So there are always lessons you can learn from smaller countries that do things very well. But it's very hard to say we could just sort of become like those countries. When it comes to the bigger kind of Western states, I say very explicitly in the introduction, I am not pretending that Germany is doing brilliantly or the US is doing brilliantly. They all have different strengths and weaknesses. And if I was writing this book about Germany or the US, I'd pick a different set of problems, but there would absolutely be a set of problems. What makes this country really unusual is that level of centralisation and that level of executive dominance, which is why I focused on those particularly. And that doesn't mean you want to flip it so that you have far too many checks and balances, which other countries would find to be a problem, or make your executive too weak, as it is in other countries. But that's why I focused on those areas in particular. I definitely don't pretend that any other states have got it all sorted.
Tom, and then
Yeah, thank you. One Tom to another. Apologise for my state of my voice. One simple observation. I remember many years ago, it was about the early 90s, reading a book by the wonderful P.J. O'Rourke with the wonderful title of Parliament of Whores. It should have won everyone's compulsory reading list so you want to understand public affairs. And inside all his salty jokes was a very important point, which is that governments, and he was picking on the American example, but it applies obviously to here, were so large that nobody, no matter how brilliant, could comprehend all of it or understand the sheer scale of it. And that's part of the problem. So there's, to put it in epistemological terms, there's a knowledge problem issue, which I suppose speaks to your point. Do you think, this is a question, do you think there is a need almost, because you sort of touched on this point when you talked about how many members of Parliament have not really very well clued up on how to actually be a legislator. Is there like a need for people going into Parliament to have the equivalent of Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive, like how to be an effective legislator, like actually how to know how to do this stuff?
Yeah.
Because I get the impression, I've seen the interviews with MPs, they haven't got a clue, for example, on the difference between the national debt and borrowing. I mean, Rachel from accounts down the road doesn't understand this. But seriously, those people don't understand basic functions of how to scrutinise legislation and do this. Do they need to go off to some sort of trained boot camp or something?
Yes, it's a huge problem that, and especially in an election like we've just had where half the MPs were changed, right? And a huge change. And so you lost a lot of people who have been around at least for a little while. There's no information. You come in as a new MP. Maybe you've been a SPAD, maybe you've been working for an MP, you've got some idea how it all works. But a lot of the new Labour MPs, a lot of the new MPs from all parties haven't been. They don't know how Westminster works. Nobody is telling them. Their parties don't do it. Parliament put on a few kind of training sessions, but very little. I was talking to an MP the other day who was saying that I was trying to listen to podcasts to find out whether how this sort of select committee thing works. It's crazy. We should just do you should absolutely have some training in how Parliament actually works, what your role is and how you can make the most of it. And we need to provide much more support on individual pieces of legislation to explain them to MPs because, you get a bill, it doesn't make much sense unless you're an expert in the topic. You need it set out and explained.
The IEA then.
I think the IFG might be doing
Well,
that kind of thing.
does some of it, but it needs to be much more systematised than it is. It's a real problem. Yeah.
we take the gentleman in the third row by the wall there? Yep. If I could just say, sorry, can we take the gentleman next to you afterwards as well, and then you can answer both questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to say how brilliant I thought your book was. So thank you very much for writing it. One of the things that I think is particularly good about the analysis is the comment on what changed British politics and society in the past in terms of universal suffrage, in terms of the welfare state, in terms of Thatcherism. Two common themes in all of those changes. There was an external group who had something to gain from organising that change, and there was an external shock that forced people to deal with that. I don't see that group of people in the UK ready to do that. Under Thatcherism, it was the IEA, the CPS, the Freedom Association, even the IFS. There were people like John Hoskins planning stepping stones. If we're going to achieve the sorts of changes that you've outlined, that sort of prior thinking has to happen, as we've had with Project 2025 in the States. And the other two things are difficult to mention in the IEA, but the only two ways I can personally see of your solution being enacted is either through a constitutional settlement, and historically that normally only happens after a civil war or a revolution, or a fragmentation of the state. And so I'd be interested in your views. That's a question. How do we get to that? Because I think that's pivotal.
Cool. And then we'll take that one. Thank you.
So you say the system might eventually break, and so you have to have these changes. Who do you predict could make these changes? You spoke about reform. Don't you think that a party that's designed to make big reform are most likely to make those reforms, rather than, for example, a party called the Conservatives?
I think that these are quite thematically linked questions in a way, aren't they?
I mean, I think it's, sorry, I didn't touch on it, don't touch on it much in the book, but I think the decline of parties and party infrastructure is a huge issue in why it's hard to generate ideas and why we've sort of seen this kind of decline in political thinking. You know, Conservative Party had 3 million members in the 1950s. It's got, 120, 130,000 now. Labour's membership has also fallen a lot. And as those kind of worlds get more and more hollowed out, there are fewer and fewer people who are engaging with them, and more people just ignore politics. And the brightest and the best ignore politics and go and do other things with their time, which makes it harder to get those kinds of groups of people together. Whether it's the people who are around Beveridge in the 40s, or the people who are around Hoskins and so on, as you say, in the 70s. I think trying, how parties can start to seriously think not just about mass membership, but building up and engaging a sort of bigger audience is part of it. But it's very difficult when in this political environment to do that. So I do think that's a big problem. On the point about kind of reform and the Conservatives, I'm not sure I see a vast amount of difference between the basic approaches at the moment. But the problem reform would have if they were somehow to get into government, and I think it's very hard because they have quite a hard ceiling at the moment, which they're kind of bumping up against. But if they were to win an election, you'd have, 350 effectively, or however many they won, new MPs, none of whom had any experience of this system whatsoever. Because they're not picking from this world, which is seen as one of their strengths. But the downside of that is I just don't think they'd have a clue what to do. I think they would find it incredibly difficult, and they would get eaten by the system very fast. And it wouldn't go very well, even if you broadly agree with their policy positions. So no, I don't. I think we might see something like that happening, but I don't think that's what's going to solve it. It has to come from people who have some understanding of how the existing system actually works.
And hopefully we don't need a civil war or a fragmentation of the country to achieve the kind of things that you want to see.
No, let's hope not. That would be bad. No, but you might need a crisis, right? Like you might need a crisis of the nature of the inflationary crisis of the 70s, or the democratic crisis of the sort of Parliament Act of 1910. To trigger it. Perhaps I think Brexit looked like it might be that crisis for a little while, but it hasn't really resolved those fundamental challenges in British politics. I think that's what Cummings hoped it would be. It would be the trigger for a lot of this to happen, but that's not how it played out. So, it'd be great if we could do without a crisis, but maybe it will take long.
So just second row from the back, gentleman here with the maroon jumper.
Hello, thank you. I asked the question with an axe to grind as a backbencher who has to deal with just terrible legislation coming through, which touches on the third point you made. It's taken us 5 days on football governance alone. God knows it should be simple enough. 400 amendments. What can be done about the quality of front benches or of either government, any government? There were people there who really couldn't run a bath. Now, no, I'm seriously, it's absolutely shocking, the quality of people who've never done a recognisable job. They've been accountable to anybody, and suddenly they're put in charge of a 40 billion budget department. And there are 110 people with the word minister in their job title. So it is something. I haven't read your book, I'm afraid, but what conclusion could you come to about that?
I thought about suggesting we go back to what the original idea of the Act of Union was in 1707, around then, and actually have a separate executive from our legislature, which we were going to do a long time ago, and then decided not to. Things would look very different if we had. There is an argument for saying if you want your legislature to focus on scrutiny, then they shouldn't be where your ministers come from, and you should have a different process for selecting your ministers. I didn't think that was ever going to be picked up by any ministers, so I didn't end up proposing it. But I think it's an interesting question. But to the sort of point about legislation, I think that the football thing is such a good example of all the themes I'm talking about. It's a small thing in itself, but it's such a good example of what I'm talking about. It's completely unnecessary. So do not need a football regulator. It's happened because the last government and this government have both thought they could get some good press out of it. And there are some sort of stakeholder groups asking for it that they've decided to appease. Once you decide to do it, you then sort of create a legislative process that doesn't work, and there's no scrutiny of it in the House of Commons. So there's no need to get the bill right, because you know you're going to be able to pass it ultimately. So it ends up as a mess in the House of Lords. Could easily end up in the courts. You can easily imagine how it would end up in the courts. So it sort of hits on all of it. And what is central government doing when it's got so many problems, massive strategic global issues, setting up a football regulator, which is one of our few industries that actually work. It's actually a really good example of all of these problems.
Oh, there you go. Do you still have a question here? I missed you behind the camera, but yeah.
Yes. You're awesome. I very much like the idea of lightening up ministerial boxes of decision-making dross. But whose boxes would you load up with this stuff instead? And do your comments in your book encompass Scottish and Welsh administrations? Thank you.
So I think a lot of it should go to mayors, insofar as it needs to exist at all. It should go to mayors. I think they should be taking a lot more of the day-to-day decision-making and oversight of public services, particularly, and also have more, as I said, more fiscal powers as well. One of my biggest regrets about the book is I don't talk about Scotland and Wales. I didn't cover Scotland and Wales, and I think one of the most common arguments I've had against the book is, why are you saying decentralisation is going to be the answer when we've done it in Scotland and Wales, and it hasn't sort of transformed those countries? And my argument is that what we did in Scotland and Wales is kind of proper devolution. We gave them, parliaments and the ability to set their own standards and their own kind of political systems. I'm not talking about doing that in England. I'm talking about decentralising operational power, delivery power. That's what we're lacking in England. So I don't think that Manchester should be able to have a different school curriculum from Newcastle or London. And I don't think schools should ultimately be inspected or assessed in a different way in different parts of the country. I think we should have a national standard, but then you have some operational control and oversight control being done away from this place. So you take some of that burden off ministers. Whereas what's happened in Scotland and Wales is, just to take education as an example, I know well, they have changed those standards. I think they have lessened those standards considerably, and that has not worked as a result. So I think it's a question of what you devolve and at what level. I'm really talking about delivery power and the state capacity, which is what we're lacking in England. Thank you.
All right. All right. Can we take these last three sort of quick fire questions all together, all from fellow think tankers, so Bart and Callum and Daniel.
Right. Thanks very much, Sam. I really enjoy your insights both here and elsewhere. You said it was difficult for ministers not to get involved in the running of public projects, the NHS, schools, because if they underperform, then they would eventually take the blame because the power is concentrated in their hands and their solution is to devolve the power. Would you agree that there is a crisis not just of the centralisation of power, but also of accountability, that state employees, Quango employees, regulators, who are really difficult to fire, are not being held accountable, yet are running the vast majority of the country's institutions? So a part of the solution would be to make it easier to remove unelected officials.
All right. Callum and Daniel?
Just have a quick question on the communications point you made. I was in the dying days of the last government, so I recognise your analysis with sort of harrowing clarity about the grid driving everything else. But how much to you, in my interpretation, was just due to a lack of the sort of the overarching ideas or narrative that should be driving the policy, etc. But I was wondering, how much to you is it more of an institutional problem, or is it just about the lack of the presence of something better, basically?
One of the things you do in the book is outline just how much Michael Gove's educational reforms actually centralised quite a lot of powers and took them away from local authorities. And yet, it seems that this is one of the few areas of unequivocal success that we've had out of the last 14 years of Conservative and coalition government. So did that experience give you any sort of pause when thinking about your general thesis that, the solution is always to decentralise, when the successes government has had over the last 15 years have actually come in concert with the centre taking over power?
All right, some good ones there. So should it be easier to remove unelected officials if they don't do their jobs well? The grid, is it okay if you've got a good overarching vision for what you're trying to achieve? And then finally, schools, was centralisation actually a good thing?
So on the first question, yes, it should be easier to get rid of officials who are underperforming, I think. But if you're going to do that, you have to have much more clarity about what you're expecting from them, and you need to give them much more power to actually achieve what you're asking them to do. So at the moment, if I'm a permanent secretary, top official in a department, I actually have relatively little control over what I can do. My delegated spend is very low. I have to get stuff signed off by the Treasury, by the Cabinet Office. I can't spend any money on marketing. I have to get that signed off. I can't hire someone on a higher salary without getting that signed off. Because I think they're brilliant and they could replace 4 people. Doesn't matter. I can't get that signed off. So my ability to do my job is very constrained. It's not then really very fair to say, well, you haven't changed anything, so we're going to fire you. I think if you say if you make it much clearer to top officials, we expect you to do this on this time scale, and we're going to give you the power to do it and the levers to do it. And if you don't do it, we're going to hold you accountable for that. Then I think it's reasonable to do that. It's the problem is constantly pushing for the accountability without the converse means you just demoralize everybody. I think there are people who absolutely would accept that quid pro quo, and if they wouldn't accept that quid pro quo, they're probably the people you want to leave, right? On the question of the grid, I think it works both ways, right? I think that the existence of that kind of grid and that way of doing things makes it harder to come up with a coherent set of ideas and a coherent narrative, because you're constantly being pushed with small announcements. So there's no space for anyone to develop what that narrative might look like, and everything comes out as a kind of jumble. But because it's so driven by the comms, not by the kind of policy process. So yes, it was absolutely harder at the end of the last government because 14 years it would run out of steam and so on. But you can see it in the new government as well. They're trying to govern more, but then they're constantly drawn back to the we need to give the press something to say, so let's say something about how we're going to do this. We're going to do deportation adverts, and then that upsets the left, and then you're having a row about that, and it's sort of constantly dragging you away from actually thinking about policy. So I think it kind of works a bit in both directions. And then on school reform, again, I'm not against the use of central power where it makes sense to use it. My argument would be the reason that the education reforms have been overall successful, I don't think they've all been successful, is actually more about curriculum change and accountability change. I think particularly changes around the curriculum, and that's where you compare it to Scotland. We went down very different routes on curriculum, and I think you can really see the difference on that. And other cultural things like the way we've done teacher training, and all of which is centralised, and I think should be centralised, right? Like I think that is exactly the kind of thing that should sit within central government. I don't think the actual day-to-day running of schools coming under the department has made it any easier or any more or less effective. And I think you could have bought trust organisations, some of which have not been good and some of which have been good, into the system in a different way that didn't involve bringing it all into the Department for Education.
All right. Let me abuse my position with one final question, which is, I suppose, to try and put a more sophisticated spin on the move fast and break things model. So, I mean, the reason we like the private sector generally is not because the private sector always succeeds. It's because when it fails, something else replaces it, and it's a constant sort of dynamic process. It's very hard for that to happen in government. So, for example, people have been saying, well, at least for 20 years, but it's probably been going on a lot longer, the Home Office is a failing institution. And yet there is no prospect whatsoever of a competitor to the Home Office growing up and supplanting it. So it seems, in a sense, what you're trying to do in this book and with your approach is to drive improvement without those natural incentives that will drive improvement. Is there some way that you can create a kind of competition between institutions of government, or at least you can sunset failing ones and have new ones spring up in their place?
I don't think competition is the only way you can motivate people, right? I think you have intrinsic motivation, but you can use individual level competition within institutions where you can't get an outside competitor. But you don't have that at the moment because civil servants aren't recognised when they do something well.
Right.
Sometimes they get embarrassed when they do something badly, so that creates a natural kind of risk aversion, right? But you look, even within the Home Office, you look at passports, right? That was completely overhauled by Abby Tierney. Now she's gone off to run Welsh rugby, which is a harder challenge. But she completely overhauled the passport system, which was a complete mess. People were waiting weeks and weeks and weeks to get their passport. Now it works. We did it. It is possible to do it. Government digital services, right? We have really good government digital services. We are capable of doing things well. But if you look at how those things happen, it's often both because of the intrinsic motivations of the individual, but because sometimes they've been bought from outside government. Sometimes they have a different way of thinking about things. They've been allowed to operate in a different way. I think the story of the government digital service is really interesting in that sense. They kind of sat a little bit outside the normal civil service, and that allowed them to function in a different way. So as I say, I'm not against competition where it's appropriate, but it won't always be appropriate. You can't run an asylum system by competition. You can't run prison. You can have some privately run prisons, but you can't run a whole prison system privately. But that doesn't mean you can't find ways to do improvement, and we know that because we do it. It just happens in a really scratchy way that we're not learning from properly.
There are other ways to sort of break up institutional inertia.
Yeah. Absolutely. And part of that is just leadership, right? Like, good secretaries of state can still make a big difference. We don't have enough of them, but they can. But it's there's not enough thinking about how you do that. There's either despair and it will never work and we should just give up, or try something totally different, or there's there's kind of contentment with the status quo, and I'm just going to go and get Telegraph headlines and get promoted, which is neither of those models work.
All right. Well, Sam, thank you very much indeed.